is Chris Hanlon. I'm joined here by my colleague Paul O'Brien, and we're both from Charities. And today we're just going to take you through basically reporting to the board for not-for-profits. So we're going to start out and have a look at some of the problem statement and then work our way through some reports. But as I mentioned, that participant count is still ticking upwards. So we'll just give it another minute or two before we start, if that's okay with everyone.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be joining Chris with this morning, and I'm going to be the director. Chris is going to be the one reporting to the board. I think that's how it's going to work.
Excellent. It looks like there's a lot of people kind of come through there now already. So as Paul said, yeah, we're going to kind of split the webinar throughout some of the slides when we step through it. So we're going to have a look at, with Paul almost having a look at the chairperson's role or the board member's role. And I'll focus more on, if I was the head of risk or the risk manager in an organization, what would I like to see? So just stepping through it, as I said, today we're going to have a look at the problem first. So we're going to start off with having a look at how do we actually get the report, what information do we have at the lowest level of the organization, and how do we end up presenting that at the highest level, and that whole operational versus strategic dilemma. We'll have a look at reporting frequency as well as some examples. So we'll have a look at how we can report to the board monthly, quarterly, maybe provide some more information, and then what an annual review might look like. And at any point in time as well, please feel free to pop questions in. There's a Q&A box. Only myself and Paul can see the person's name in there as well. So you can pop your question in there anonymously as well too, if you like. And for those of you that this is your first webinar as well, the webinar is recorded and we will share the recording and a link to slides and resources and things like that afterwards. So I think we can actually crack on and jump straight into our first slide. So just a bit about us. So for those of you who don't know us, we are a company called Charities. And basically, we're risk and compliance professionals. So we provide a governance, risk and compliance solution that's used by not-for-profits right across the UK and Ireland. They use it for everything from risk assessment, incident management, task management, audit findings, and everything else. And the one thing that unites the management team is our background in risk and compliance and governance. So our backgrounds are from all sorts of different industries, including insurance, the wider financial services space, not-for-profit, multinationals, and things like that too. But I said we're going to jump straight in because I know we had this webinar just for 30 minutes today. So we're going to almost start with the problem statement. And I think, Paul, you're going to kick us off here first, I think, by talking a bit about the strategic plan. And
yeah, the objective, I suppose, is to take a look at what the requirements of the strategic plan, particularly in risk terms. So fundamentally, the objectives of the strategic plan, and that's all driven from the purpose of the organization. We're going to take a look at that, and we're also going to take a look at the corporate level risks. So a lot of the time, risk is managed at, I suppose, two levels. It's managed at the roll-up level, if you like, that affects the strategic objectives, but operationally, there are also the detailed objectives that bring the corporate piece together. So we're going to look at that as well. And what we're interested in is reporting to the board primarily. So it's reporting at this level and it's reporting to this level will be the main focus today.
Yeah, and as Paul said as well, you have that strategic plan at the top and maybe corporate risks that underpin the strategic plan that we tend to report to the board. But if I put my head of risk or risk manager hat on, maybe lower in the organization, we probably have these departmental or thematic risk registers that are full of lots of detail. So they might, as I mentioned, they might be departmental. So they could be for the corporate services department or the services department or whatever it might be. Typically spreadsheet driven with lots of risks and controls and things like that as well. Then underpinning that, if you like, or the bottom section of the pyramid, we have even more management information as well. And really, this is part of the problem in itself, is that we have all of this information, but where sometimes organizations struggle to link it back to our corporate risk and strategic plan. So we have these key risk indicators. And in a lot of cases, they already exist, and there's things that organizations already measure. They can act as early warning indicators, but as I mentioned, we really struggle to build the links back into our operational risk register and then likewise upwards. We've audits and assurance findings as well. And again, those things tend to live separately in organizations. So we tend to have an audit finding or assurance or a second line assurance finding, but the links don't tend to be established. It's almost like there's separate things that happen in the organization and it doesn't kind of filter its way back up to our corporate risk register or our strategic plan. And then the last piece of the pyramid, if you like, is incidents. And organizations will have lots of different phrases or terminology that they might use. Some will call them loss events, operational risk events, whatever the phrase you use is, it's important that if we're collecting that management information, that we're doing something with it, that the operational risk register isn't completely separated from all of this management information, that we're using this MI to basically influence the scoring of the operational risk registers, likewise then working our way up to our strategic plan. And therein lies the dilemma, I suppose, in that we have all of this information that in the bottom of the pyramid, and how do we actually filter that back up to the top, to our board or to our chairperson in Paul's case here, but make the report meaningful. Let's not try and make the report 20 or 30 pages, if that makes sense. So that's really our problem statement. And then moving on, as I mentioned there, we have that kind of operational versus strategic dilemma, which we alluded to. So the operational piece being that we just have a lot of detail. Typically, we gather up lots of key risk indicators throughout the organization, lots of incident information. They might be something to do with the service our organization provides, or they could just be internal policy breaches. We tend to gather up lots of granular risks. So there might be risk assessments around the services. If we're a housing organization, there might be something to do with the properties or assets that we have. And then likewise then as well, we sometimes tend to be silo driven as well when we're focusing on the operation side of things. So if I say I'm the IT manager, sometimes I just focus on my category or my operational area. So I end up building just an IT risk register, or just for my department, or perhaps for the wider organization. But then when we look at the strategic level, then maybe over to Paul for this point.
You're looking at, again, the high level, which is sort of back to the purpose of the organization, why the organization exists. And I would make the observation at this stage to be careful that we're talking about organizations. Some will be large and some will be very small. So we don't know the resources that you're dealing with, but effectively the principles are the same. In many cases, you'll find that the same individual is wearing many hats, but nonetheless, the strategic high-level objectives are the key. So your strategic plan, what are you here to do? What are you here to achieve? And then you're looking at the big things that would threaten that achievement, whether it's the funding arrangements, whether it's the compliance stuff, these things that can be threatened at the highest level. What you need to know at the strategic point at the board is you need to know that these things are, first, that the organization is aware of the requirements, aware of the need and necessity, aware of the objectives, and then that the information is being gathered. So you're not going to be surprised by stuff. And that's one of the key things that the board are interested in.
Absolutely. And then Paul, over to you. I think we have a slide here about what you want to know as a director, and before I kind of move over to say what I want the directors to know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and let the slide build, and in letting the slide build, I suppose the key thoughts that ran in my head here was that my reputation, or is my reputation, at risk as a result of my association with this organization. So in some cases it's personal, and I don't want my reputation bound up in an organization that isn't doing or performing well or isn't managing its risk well. So that's one of the assurances that the reporting needs to give me. So I'm looking at the kind of things that are important to the organization. First of all, the reporting gives me assurance. It gives me assurance, but it also gives me the opportunity to give assurance to others, to whoever's making the report, and to the board itself, to the executive team, and to the depth of the organization. So culturally, it's important that the organization knows that the risk is being managed, talked about, thought through, and effectively reported. There's an opportunity in the reporting also to ask questions and to get deeper understanding if you need a deeper understanding. And that process operates both ways. So it's an opportunity also for the executive or the risk management team or the compliance people to ask for resources if they feel that they're pressed or it's not being, if their feeling is the activity isn't succeeding because of lack of resource, that's an opportunity. And I suppose the issue, principally, these reports, the opportunity to report is about understanding the big concerns. And for me, one of the things is to be prepared to talk about any risk or risk event that's topical, particularly if it's in our sector, so the sector you're addressing, and be ready to answer the obvious, could this happen here, questions. And that's the kind of thing that happens in the dynamic of a meeting when somebody that is that's presenting to an organization, to a board particularly, comes across. Be aware of what's going on around the world, around your space. And then I suppose what you're looking at also is you're looking for a culture of shared knowledge. So the relationship between the board and the executive it sets the culture and tone of the organization. And that needs to be free and open, particularly about the risks that the organization faces and that the depth of the organization understands it faces. Not sure if that gives you an answer, but it's touched on in the slide deck.
Absolutely, and I think Paul's point there around the personal reputation is probably almost a separate webinar, I think, in itself, given the voluntary aspect of directors and committee members. The personal reputation being one of those things that, as you mentioned, Paul, around scandals or whatever kind of phrase we want to put on it, it is quite topical. And yet, as a head of risk or a risk manager, we need to be able to kind of filter out our reports or make our reports a bit more dynamic to show that we are addressing this sort of stuff as well. So that brings us on what I, as the head of risk or risk manager, want the directors to know. So kind of a slightly different view of what Paul just alluded to. So I obviously want them to know the top 10 risks, and not just know, but I want them to understand the top 10 risks. And really, when I say 10 here, you can replace 10 with X, basically. The way I like to think about it is what risks could materially stop us achieving the purpose of the organization or the strategic plan. So back to that point in the pyramid that Paul mentioned earlier on. And what have we done since our last board meeting to mitigate risks? So maybe at the board meeting, we had a look at those top 10 risks or whatever it might have been. Did we agree any actions? Are the actions complete? Are they overdue? Are we tracking well against them? How are we reporting on all of that? So if the actions are overdue, I also wanted directors to know why they're overdue. Is it a resource constraint? Is it that something happened? Did we have another audit finding? Did we have a breach? Did we have an incident? I wanted directors to understand why the action might not be done. Where have we improved since our last board meeting? So that's a bit of trend analysis. Are our top 10 risks trending downwards? Are our KRIs maybe trending downwards? So all of that management information that we're actually capturing, rather than just being static reporting, are we actually showing some trend analysis? And Paul mentioned the word assurance a few times. Am I providing the board with the right assurance that it's not just a static report? Am I showing that, look, we are actually putting these controls in place and we are trending downwards or managing risk well? Am I showing the board that the decisions that they're having, what impact is it having in the organization? So if I'm reporting upwards or inwards to the board, are there any policies that we need to change? Do we need to change our conflicts of interest or HR or information security policies, for example? What new controls have we implemented, or have we had to change any controls? Any new risks emerging from regulatory horizons scanning, any issues in the wider sector that Paul alluded to? Are we stretching our resources too thin? So back to that point around what are we doing to mitigate our risks? Are there any actions that are overdue while we're trying to deal with audit findings and the business as usual aspect of risk management as well in the organization? Is our risk appetite too limiting? And likewise, is our risk appetite too high? Now is my chance to kind of report into the board and say, actually, do you know what? I think our risk appetite statement might need to be refreshed. Our KRIs might be wrong, for example. And then the last piece then as well, I just want to allude to here is, and it's back to that lower level of the pyramid that we looked at earlier on, the loss events that we have experienced, the incidents, and likewise as well, we can also report here on our audit findings or assurance findings. Are we seeing any trends there, for example? Did we have an event or a loss event on access that was related to access controls? And perhaps our internal auditor also picked up on it and led to a fraud event, for example. Just linking all of that back, tying it back to our top 10 risks and showing the board that we might have a material weakness somewhere. And here's the hard evidence that actually backs up that material weakness. So I think over the next few slides, we're going to basically have a look at the different aspects of what we could actually include as well as we step through different board reports. So when we're thinking about monthly reports, one of the things I know a lot of our own clients struggle with as well is when you're reporting to the board or even a committee, and in a lot of instances, you're actually not in the room with the board or the committee. You're a PowerPoint slide that maybe someone has carried up to the board, or maybe they're reading it independently. And it can be difficult for the board to juggle that with, you know, we need to review our strategic plan, our finance report, our ops report. So one of the things we see that lands quite well with directors and committee members is graphics instead of words, basically. If there's a Teams at a board meeting, reflect that in the report. So I'm just going to pick on that cyber example that I mentioned earlier on as well. So Have we noticed that we're having an issue with, well, hang on, our internal auditor is flagging that we have an issue around cybersecurity. We've had some incidents on cybersecurity. We have a cybersecurity risk in our top 10 risks as well. Do we need to create a cybersecurity report and maybe flag some potential concerns that we might have? Are there any new regulatory requirements that need to be addressed? So that bit of horizon scanning as well. Do we need to implement any new controls or policies or procedures that will help us satisfy any potential compliance requirements both today, but also in 6 months' time? Let's not try be compliant one day out from a new piece of regulation. Am I responding to any previous requests to investigate or do a risk assessment? That's back to Paul's point earlier on as well, when he mentioned that assurance piece. The directors are free to put a request in to say that we should dig deeper into this. So we continue that cybersecurity example. Have they asked us to do a deep dive? Have they asked us to compare ourselves against something like Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001? Have we conducted a gap analysis? How do we report that back up to the board then as well? And then it's my opportunity as well as the head of risk then to kind of comment on all those concerns and any trends as well. So taking that low level lying information in the organization where it might be too much in terms of quantity to actually present back to the board, but are there any trends? Can I comment on any of the trends that I'm actually seeing in our key risk indicators, our top 10 risks, audit findings, incidents, loss events, rather than providing 20 pages of raw information? Can I summarize all of that into a paragraph or a graph in itself? And then as the head of risk then as well, am I looking for any approval or some action or for initiative? Am I looking to maybe hire someone? Am I looking to change the way we do something? Am I looking to maybe change our risk management framework or key risk or risk appetite framework, changing some limits or anything like that? Now is a time to kind of do that kind of dynamically as well. What a lot of organizations will leave it as part of the annual review, and we'll touch on that. Sometimes we find that after an annual review, people have to tweak something thereafter as well. And I think Paul was just going to touch on some of the other points then as well around what we should include in that report.
Thanks, Chris. You probably summarized an awful lot of the issues here, but this would be typical list. If you're doing this on a monthly basis, two things: concise and precise. So keep it short. Graphics are great. Trends are terrific. Small words, but make sure that the information you're sharing is accurate and up to date. And a lot of, Chris alluded to the board committees. So some organizations are mandated to have board committees. Other organizations do it on a voluntary basis. It's useful if depends again on the size and complexity of the organization. If you have that opportunity to for some of the executives that are responsible for risk and compliance stuff to sit with some of the board that are interested, that have formed a committee to do it, come back to the main board, that those more detailed conversations out of the boardroom, and effectively let the committee report back with the executive to the board that they have considered these things in detail, particularly when you get in to some of the stuff that Chris alluded to, like cybersecurity risks, the data protection risks. Some of that stuff is incredibly detailed. And one of the things, the observations that I would make is that directors are not experts in this topic, in this field. They can't be experts in everything. You may have one or two that might be particularly expert in the finance or perhaps even in the IT stuff. You might find that. But then you don't want one-on-one conversations either with some of the experts in the room. But I'm not an expert on a lot of the stuff that I've dealt with as a director over time. The kind of stuff we've listed here are typical. They're examples. They're examples if you're going to do a monthly report. But bottom line is concise and precise is far better. And if somebody has questions to ask, they can either take them out of the boardroom and have that conversation with you, whoever's presenting the report, one-on-one. But for me, a monthly report should be limited to quick, factual summaries.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point that Paul mentioned as well about sometimes as the risk manager or the executive responsible for managing risk as well, we do need to keep that point in the back of our head that there may be no one on the board, for example, that has that background in risk. So while we're looking at all of that information around KRIs and incidents, even things like abbreviations and using the phrase KRIs control people, people might not understand what we actually mean in that regard as well. So, and just to have a look at some of maybe a more detailed report then as well that we would have done with one of our clients recently. So they wanted to be able to show the link between basically a corporate level risk and some of the lower lying information. So we think back to that pyramid we had a look at earlier on, where we had our strategic plan and our corporate risk at the top, but we had all this underlying information at the bottom, and how do we actually tie it all back together. So you can see in this report, although it is probably a bit granular, you'll see it when we send the slides out. Basically what I have is I have a risk around IT failures and leading to a confidentiality breach. But as I actually build the report, I can now start seeing some of that trend analysis. So I can see back in June 2023, the risk was 10.5. But when we did it, the assessment a couple of days later or a week later, we actually implemented some new controls and the risk has decreased. I can then stay scrolling through the report as well. So I can actually come in and have a look and see that it's actually linked back to an objective, which is about maintaining compliance with regulatory obligations. I can continue to reveal more of that report, and I can show that it's actually linked maybe to the IT manager or head of IT's report or risk register. Here's some, is it 6 risks there that it's linked back to that are underpinning the scoring basically as well. I can then have a look at my key risk indicators as well. So any of those key risk indicators can also be linked back. And then likewise, we touched as well on earlier on in some of the previous slides around what are we doing to actually mitigate the risk. So it's one thing showing the board that this risk might be flagging as red or amber or 9 or whatever way our organization describes risk, but what are we actually doing to mitigate that level of risk, if that makes sense. So that's all here. And likewise, we could show incidents, we could show audit findings, assurance findings. So it's just about how do we tie this back. And in 10 pages, I could probably show my board or committee the top 10 risks to that organization, as well as all the underlying information as to why I think the risk level might be where it's at. And then just very briefly, just to touch on then what a standard risk register might look like. So we just took a kind of a fairly standard template. We just said, look, this is the risk description, the controls you have in place, the scoring, the tasks. And again, this is what a sample, maybe corporate level risk register might look like. It could have 20 other columns as well if we really wanted to. But what I really wanted to point out here was that, again, making that underlying information available to the board. So I can see that I have my confidentiality breach in row number 1, but then under that in the yellow cells, I actually have different lower, more operational risks. So again, linking us back to that pyramid at the very beginning, I actually have those operational risks that are underpinning that corporate level risk. Again, quite detailed, but all the information is there as well. So while Paul said not all directors will be experts, it's still important that we have all of that information readily available for directors should they ask. Then just to touch on kind of quarterly reports then as well. So basically every organization is going to be different on how they want to report. We've assumed that we're going to do fairly standard monthly reports that will kind of be high level, will take a fairly consistent view for the 10 or 12 board meetings we might have a year. We've then also assumed that maybe every quarter we'll do a bit of a deep dive. So if you like, the first 2 pages, for example, in this dummy report will be our monthly report, but then in page 3, we want to do a deep dive into, look, let's see more on tasks, risks, events, compliance, and whatever else it might be. So we want to have a look at things like significant changes from our previous quarter, the control effectiveness, which Paul already alluded to, and I think we had a bit of a bar graph there as well, just to kind of show it rather than having lots of underlying information. Are there any emerging risks? So Paul mentioned as well, just even doesn't necessarily need to be a regulatory. It could just be something that we're seeing in the press. It could be that the regulator has actually picked up on something and said, actually, you know, we're seeing this as a trend as part of our investigations into certain charities or not-for-profits, that we're seeing this. Maybe the regulator just even issued a blog or a press release around something. Not everything needs to stem from legislation or regulation. And I just included a quick grab of a dashboard as well, just to kind of show that we can have that detail, sorry, the high level, but again, underpinning it is all of that detailed information then as well. And I'm conscious of time. I do see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box as well. So just to kind of touch on, I think was probably almost our last slide. Reporting to the board and almost having a look at it from an annual point of view is much more of a strategic shift, if that makes sense. So while lots of boards will review the risk register annually, quarterly, whatever it might be, Really what we want to touch on here annually is the strategic kind of thing. So the risk management framework. And by framework, I don't just mean our categorization of risk. I mean our policies, our procedures, how we do risk assessments, who's involved, roles and responsibilities, reporting structures and governance structures and everything else. Having a look at that risk profile, which I already mentioned. So do the board or relevant committee members, do they actually review the full risk register on at least an annual basis? Are they familiar with it? They don't need to be familiar with every single control, but is it something that we actually review on an annual basis? What about our risk management maturity? And in terms of the maturity, we can look at it across people, process, technology, and governance. So if we have a look at that, where are we shooting for? Do we need to make tweaks to our governance process, maybe to move up that maturity scale? A lot of organizations will tend to think around and focus on room for improvement rather than looking back and actually saying, actually, what did we achieve over the last 12 months? So I think in a lot of cases, boards and risk managers or executives with responsibility for risk almost need to take time to be able to look back and say, actually, yeah, we have achieved a lot over the last 12 months. Maybe we've implemented a new incident management process or whatever it might be. Are there any key risk drivers or events? So what's driving us to do all of this? So obviously we want to achieve our strategic plan or to be objectives laid out in our strategic plan, but is there anything else that's driving us towards this? Is it the fact that we're merging with another not-for-profit? Are we, is the regulator asking us to do something, for example? Likewise, when looking back over the achievements over the last 12 months, it's important to step back and have a look at what our priorities are for the next 12 months as well. So is there anything that we need to be conscious of from a risk point of view? Is the organization moving into a new area? Are we launching a new service? Whatever it might be, and how is that going to impact how we do risk management? And then the last point I'm going to touch on here then as well is the strategic plan. So if the board are reviewing the strategic plan either annually or every 3 years or whatever it might be, again, how does the risk function feed into that? Are there new goals, new objectives, new KRIs that we need to be feeding in, new things we need to be tracking and things like that as well? So just wanted to touch on that. And I know, Paul, I think you wanted to touch on the annual report itself here as well.
Just to bear in mind and remember that the annual report, there are some organizations that have a stipulation that requires an annual report to be put together, and there is a risk section, generally a risk compliance section in those reports. And I tend to think of this not reporting to the board, but it's reporting with the board. So it's very important to get those reports done. And I know that there are now some specifics, and Chris hates me to use the term, but the ESG reporting is now becoming quite significant in a number of sectors as well, almost as a mandatory annual report. But what the annual report should concern itself with is the strategy, obviously, the objectives and the threats to those objectives. And I tend to think of it in terms of two things. One, what are the growing concerns? As distinct from going concerns, what are the growing concerns? And the other one then is the ongoing concerns. So every organization will have those. It's a kind of worry beads that board and executive generally share. There won't be surprises to anybody, they shouldn't be, but they should be reflected in the reality of the annual reporting. Not just the negative, but as Chris said, to the positive stuff as well, but talk about the growing concerns and the ongoing concerns.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm conscious we're just about up on time. So just to briefly summarize kind of what we went through today. So different reports for monthly, quarterly, annually. And as I said, every organization is going to be slightly different, particularly if you report into a risk or an audit and risk committee or a finance audit and risk committee first before going to the board. You might provide more detail there and then a higher level summary then into the board. Paul alluded to making sure that the recipients of the report are getting what they need. So that was basically what Paul wanted to know as a director. Only include the detail where requested. So that's just to make it as easy as possible for the directors to be able to digest that information. Can we provide some kind of pre-meeting documentation that might supplement some of the high-level information, just to make it easier for the board, again, to digest the information? And then communicating with the board is key to the success of the risk management effort. So Paul alluded to that, reporting with the board. So it's important that we don't feel like we're reporting into the board, and it's that the board directors need to challenge respectfully, and that is part of their job, but it's also part of my job as the risk manager or the head of risk to be able to provide the board with adequate assurance. So it does work both ways, and the board and the executive with responsibility for risk need to have that good working relationship, basically, to be able to work together rather than work against each other. And that's really it from us. I do know we have a couple of questions here in the Q&A that I'm going to just try and touch on. So someone has asked us, can we give some examples of key risk indicators? Basically, it really depends on your own organization. So I'm going to pretend that I'm a services organization in the, let's just say something like the homeless space, for example. Sorry, I'm just going to try and close the box out of the way. Some of the examples might be health and safety incidents. How many health and safety incidents, reportable health and safety incidents did we have in the last month or the last quarter? How many complaints did we have? If we're a different organization that maybe provides telephone services or phone line services, was our phone system down in the last quarter? What was the percentage uptime? So there are a lot of things that you're probably already measuring, for example. And a lot of it is just think about having it as a red, amber, green system. So maybe we go into a breach. The amber section might act as an early warning indicator. The red section will act as a KRI breach. And we might actually end up having a contingency plan. So what I can do is, I know key risk indicators is always a hot topic. As part of sending out these resources, I'll also send, I think we have some slides around key risk indicators. There's probably 2 or 3 slides that I could send out there as well. So when you get the resources emailed with the link to the recording and the slides for this, I'll also include a couple of slides around key risk indicators, because I do know it is quite a hot topic. There's another question here. There's a lot of talk around upside risk, as in the risk of not doing something. So what are our thoughts on this? It's a really good question. It's back to what Paul alluded to there as well, that risk doesn't have to be negative. So a lot of time is focusing on the achievements. And then there is that thing around opportunity risk as well, that if we don't do something, we might miss out on this opportunity. And a lot of organizations are shifting towards that. And that's where I think it really brings us back to linking the risk back to the strategic plan allows us to see that potential upside risk as well. So we can easily, quickly generate reports that say, if our objective is to move into a certain area or grow or launch a new service, well, these are the risks that might stop us achieving that objective. But ultimately, the objective is the upside, if that makes sense. So achieving the objective is the upside, and the downside is one of those risks crystallizing, if that makes sense. So that's where that link between the corporate risk register and the strategic plan really comes into play. I'm not sure, Paul, if you have anything to add into the upside.
The only thing I'd add into the upside is, no matter what you do with risk and risk management, there are certain things you have to do. And unfortunately, risk has tended to be driven a lot. And the thought process around risk tends to be driven a lot by compliance, which is maybe the stuff you're forced to do, if you like, to protect the society. But yeah, there's opportunity risk there as well. And you make a decision, you are often confronted with a decision. If I invested this in that space, I could grow this, but I could also lose my investment. And it's that kind of decision process when you're thinking strategically. We would have seen it, for example, in a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the insurance industry, for example. And we've seen it in some of the financial sectors, that somebody's making decisions to make an acquisition for a purpose that's an upside, if you like, of the fact that they've been successful in their growth strategy, but they haven't been successful in organic growth. They make a decision to take a risk and go and acquire. And you'll see some of that. The question is also framed as not taking action, and that's risk avoidance, if you like. And yes, but at the same time, any operation, any organization, anything that you're doing has risk. And anybody who tells you it hasn't isn't doing much, quite frankly. Everything has risk, and it's up to you as organizations, both executive and board level, to make decisions on whether this is for you or it's not for you. And sometimes you make decisions that it's not for you and subsequently regret them. When others get the upside, but it's, yeah, make your own call. It's very much a judgment. Absolutely, yeah. I'm conscious we're going a couple of minutes over. I think they're the only 2 questions. But as I said to you, you will get a link to the recording, the slides, and we will include a couple of slides, additional slides on the key risk indicator stuff as well. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I hope you found it useful. If you do have any feedback, do feel free to email us, or if you have any suggestions on what you'd like the next webinar topic to be, do feel free to let us know. And in the meantime, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.